On the night that Ronia was born, a thunderstorm was raging over the mountains, such a storm that all the goblin folk in Matter's forest crept back in terror to their holes and hiding places. Only the fierce harpies preferred stormy weather to any other, and flew shrieking and hooting around the robbers' stronghold on Matter's mountain. This is the start of the book Ronia, the Robber's Daughter by Astrid Lindgren, a book that has been with me through all my childhood and beyond. Now today I'd like to tell you bits and pieces of Ronia's story, and maybe afterwards you want to know more and you're going to read the whole book by Astrid Lindgren. Now first of all, what you have to know about Ronia, and what the title probably gives away, is that Ronia is the daughter of a robber chieftain. Now this robber, Ronia's father, he was not any kind of robber, no, he was the best. The mightiest and fiercest robber chieftain you can imagine. And actually, if you had been unfortunate enough to live in Sweden at that time and had to go into the forest, and he found you, he would take everything off you, maybe only leave you with your underwear. But then, if you could cross those forests without ever seeing Mattis, you might be unfortunate enough to go to the next forest, and there you will meet another robber. His name is Borka. Borka, he was a fierce robber as well, and Mattis and Borka, they hated each other. Actually, their fathers had hated each other, and the grandfathers had hated each other, and the whole family had hated each other for generations. There's no way a Borka robber would ever be friends with a Mattis robber. Now we know that Mattis had a daughter, Ronia. But what people didn't know, what was a bit of a secret, was that Borka actually had a son, Birk Borkason. Now he was as brave, as wild, as strong as Ronia. The two of them had never met until one day. Now before I can tell you about that day, you have to know where Ronia lived. She lived on a huge mountain in a fortress. Now that mountain was called Mattis Mountain, and the fortress, it was big enough to hold 2 bands of robbers. But Ronia and her robbers, they only lived in one half of the fortress, and that was due to the huge thunderstorm that had been raging on the night that Ronia was born. During that thunderstorm, a lightning had struck the castle and split it in half, and now all they could do was live in just one half of it. The 2 halves, they were divided by a gap, a very deep, deep gap. They called it Hell's Gap. Nobody really knew how deep it was, because it was not only going through the fortress, it was going right down into the mountain as well. Of course, Mattis and his wife had always told their daughter Ronia not to go to Hell's Gap, to stay clear of it, because it was so dangerous. But Ronia, being Ronia, she went up there one day when her parents weren't looking. She crept up to the roof of the castle, and she went to look at Hell's Gap. Now I think you know what you do if you want to know how deep something is, don't you? You pick up a stone, and then you drop it down, and you listen, and you count. You count until you can hear the stone dropping to the bottom. And that's exactly what Ronia did. She threw down a tiny stone into Hell's Gap. She bent over it, listening, counting, and counting. But she never ever heard that stone hit the bottom. That's how deep Hell's Gap was, and even Ronia felt a little afraid of it. Now Hell's Gap was deep, but it wasn't really wide. It was actually very narrow, and you could jump over it if you wanted to. But that would be crazy. Who would do that? Now just as Ronia thought that, she could hear whistling from the other side, and she looked up, and there on the other side of the fortress, with his legs dangling over the gap, there was a boy with flaming red hair. Ronia looked at him, and he looked at her, and he said, "I know who you are. You are Ronia, the robber's daughter. You're always climbing trees and running through the forest and jumping into rivers. Well, I am Beag Borca's son, the son of Borca. And me and the Borca robbers, we're now living in this castle, and the half that you're not living in, and there's nothing you and your strong father can do to change that. Ronia was furious as she heard that, and she wished she could go over there and punch him on the nose, but there was Hell's Gap between them, and if it wasn't for that, she would go there and punch him so hard his nose would fly off, and that's exactly what she told him. But Beag just laughed, and he got up, and he went a few paces backwards, and then he started to run towards her and Hell's Gap. And Ronia stared at him because she knew exactly what he was planning. And really, when he reached Hell's Gap, he didn't stop, but he jumped, and he flew over Hell's Gap and landed right in front of her. Now, here I am, robber's daughter. Do you still want to punch me so that my nose can fly off? Or maybe you want to jump as well? Or are you too much of a coward to do that? No, you shouldn't have said that. There's nothing a Borca robber can do that a Mattes robber can't. And so without saying anything, Ronia took a few steps backwards, and then she was running towards Hell's Gap, running, and then she jumped and she flew over Hell's Gap and landed safely on the other side. She turned around. Beag was looking at her. Ronia was looking at him, and without saying anything, they both jumped again, and again, and again, and again. It turned into a chase. They were running and jumping, never stopping. Even though their lungs were burning, their feet and their legs were hurting. But none of them wanted to stop. Ronia didn't want to be the first to stop. And Beag, he definitely didn't want to be the first to stop. So they kept on jumping, flying over Hell's Gap. Until something terrible happened. Ronia had just landed, when behind her she could hear Beag yelling. She turned around and she saw that he had landed just behind her, but he had stepped on one of those loose stones lying around the gap and slipped. And as she watched, he fell back and vanished into Hell's Gap. Ronia closed her eyes, and she wished that she had never met Beag Borcason. She wished that they had never jumped. There's no point wishing something hasn't happened if it just did happen. So she crept forward to look. She had to look. She crept forward and she looked down into Hell's Gap. And as she looked down, Beag's face was staring up at her. He had been lucky. When he fell, he landed on a beam that was sticking out from the broken walls. Now there was not much space. If he moved a bit to the right or to the left, he would vanish and never be seen again. But he was also lucky because Ronia, always running around in the forest, climbing trees, climbing mountains, she had a leather rope tied to her belt, and she took that one off now and handed it down to Beag. He tied it around himself, and she did the same with the other end, and then she held on tight to it, called to Beag to start climbing. As Beag started to climb out of Hell's Gap, the rope tightened around Ronia, and it got so tight that she thought she would split in half, just like the fortress. Before that could happen, though, Beag had managed to climb out of Hell's Gap, and he gave her back the rope, and he thanked her. And he said, "You know, after this, maybe we should be friends." Now Ronia, she looked at him, and she said, "Friends? You and me? A Borca robber? Not in your life!" And then finally she punched him. Not as hard that his nose would fly off, but she punched him pretty hard. But instead of being angry, Beag just laughed, and he said, "Don't do that again, but thank you for saving me anyway." And then he stepped back, and he started to run. And he ran, and then he jumped. and he flew over Hell's Gap and landed safely on the other side. He turned around and said, "Well, I see you again, Ronia, robber's daughter." And with that, he vanished into the fortress, back to the Borka robbers. And that is the story of how Birk Borkason and Ronia, the robber's daughter, met for the first time. Now, if you want to know more about them, and maybe if they ever become friends, or of their other adventures, just have a look at the book Ronia, the Robber's Daughter by Astrid Lindgren. For now, I wish you a happy World Book Day and all the best. Goodbye.